Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Progressive American. I'm Connor, back with another morning podcast about the week's news from a progressive perspective. Welcome back to the show. It is Saturday, September 25th, and today we have a lot to get into, so let's just jump into it. Just when you thought that the Cuomo name couldn't cause more trouble, new allegations emerge. This time they're directed at CNN's own Chris Cuomo. In a piece submitted to the New York Times, Cuomo's former boss at ABC News, Shelley Ross, outlined his previous misconduct, alleging that he grabbed her rear without her consent and in front of her husband. Further supporting her case, Ross showed an email from Cuomo where he apologized for his conduct and even apologized to her husband for it. She viewed it as an attempt to hide from the consequences of his harassment and the consequences of being caught by her husband. The event occurred after Cuomo had left Ross's supervision and was independent of her authority, and according to Ross, Cuomo said that he could do it to her because, quote, "You're no longer my boss." In her piece for the New York Times, Ross notes that she doesn't want Cuomo to lose his job, saying, quote, "I have no job against Mr. Cuomo. I'm not looking for him to lose his job. Rather, this is an opportunity for him and his employer to show what accountability can look like in the Me Too era," end quote. The fact that she can restrain herself despite what Cuomo did to her is astounding, I will admit. That said, this behavior is not acceptable, past or present. Chris Cuomo helps New York's former governor, his brother, respond to allegations of sexual misconduct, and only divulged that information when other reporters spilled the story. Even before the public knew this, Cuomo still had ethical problems with his position. His time has long since passed, and his power over the air should come to an immediate end. I understand that Mrs. Ross doesn't want this to be about retribution, and I commend her for that. But if Cuomo is willing to do this to somebody who once held authority over him, he is willing to do it to somebody else who doesn't. That possibility is completely and utterly intolerable. No amount of Trump bashing will change that. Cuomo has released a statement saying that he apologized for his mistake, but the fact of the matter is that he never paid for it. It's a pattern of behavior that needs to end in these institutions. If something isn't done to end it, it will only get worse. You cannot simultaneously critique Trump for his treatment of women without simultaneously coming to terms with your own. And I mean, is it too much to ask for people not to sexually harass their former bosses when they're literally the icons of public discourse? I genuinely have a problem with not only how we think about this, but how little we seem to care. It's like, oh, yep, we've got another sexual harasser in the media. Oh, we've got another person with power and political influence. Yeah, they felt it was appropriate to touch a woman without her consent. Like, it's the simplest thing. Don't touch your coworker without her or his consent. That should not be an issue in today's age, and yet it continues to be, and someone like Cuomo could possibly keep his job even though he admitted he did it, and he's faced no repercussions whatsoever from anybody in power, whether it was at ABC or at CNN, and this has gotta stop. In less media news, we turn to the border. On Tuesday, the Biden administration expressed their horror at videos released by Al Jazeera and Reuters that showed border agents clashing and running into migrants gathered at encampments at the border. In one instance, the video showed a migrant being driven into the water, and in another video, one of the agents can be heard cussing out one of the Haitian migrants and nearly running over the migrants with his horse. The Biden administration announced that they would punish those responsible for the actions, with Jen Psaki saying, "I don't think anyone seeing that footage would think it's acceptable or appropriate." These comments ring particularly hollow for the already 300 Haitian refugees who were deported. The Biden administration has deported many of these migrants before they even make their asylum applications within America, thanks to a Trump-era executive order that allows them to do this under the guise of public health. This is despite the fact that the law they are using was never applied to immigration before Trump enacted it and Biden carried it out. It is also worth noting that these migrants are not just people who are being coaxed to come here without so much as a concern for the rule of law. They are coming here because their leader, President Moise, was assassinated and a devastating 7.2 earthquake has rocked their country. So when the state is forcing people to leave before they even have a chance to apply for asylum, which is legal by the way, it is just cruel. Imagine for a moment if the President of the United States were to die today. Nobody knows who is supposed to replace them, and riots are starting across the country. Then, in the middle of that political mess, you have an earthquake that devastates your community. What would you do? Honestly, what are you supposed to do? Just sit there? Probably not. So it is particularly damning that the Biden administration has failed to uphold its humanitarian promises for immigrant communities. America needs a wholesale restructuring of its immigration policy if things like this are allowed. In foreign policy news, we turn to the United Nations. On Tuesday, President Biden addressed the international community in a speech in New York. The speech, which is part of Biden's more diplomatic approach to foreign policy, hit on the notes of his 2020 campaign's Build Back Better program. During his speech, Biden warned against divisiveness and unnecessary conflict. Promoting his partnership with U.S. allies, Biden's speech was an attempt to rebuild the United States' reputation in the international community after the previous administration. In his speech, Biden stated that,
"It's my honor to speak to you for the first time as President of the United States. We meet this year in a moment of intermingled with great pain and extraordinary possibility. We've lost so much to this devastating pandemic that continues to claim lives around the world and impact so much on our existence. We're mourning more than 4.5 million people of every nation, from every background. Each death is an individual heartbreak, but our shared grief is a poignant reminder that our collective future will hinge on our ability to recognize our common humanity and to act together. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the clear and urgent choice that we face here at the dawning of what must be a decisive decade for our world. A decade that will quite literally determine our futures. As a global community, we're challenged by urgent and looming crises, wherein lie enormous opportunities if we can summon the will and resolve to seize these opportunities. Will we work together to save lives, defeat COVID-19 everywhere, and take the necessary steps to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic, for there will be another one? Or will we fail to harness the tools at our disposal as the more virulent and
While this
dangerous
speech is
take
good,
hold?
and I think there are more cooperative agreements we need, they will also be incredibly difficult. For one, Biden's commitment to a new political order in the international community comes just a week after the French withdrew their ambassador from the United States over its deal with the UK and Australia. Those who watched the last episode will know that the United States made a deal with the Australians that helped them develop submarines to defend themselves against China. But in doing so, they cut France out of a similar deal that they had with Australia. Then there is also the risk of unintentionally setting off a Cold War with China, as playing one's hand in a too firm a manner can undermine the stability and peace that the Biden administration seeks to maintain. Ultimately, the Biden administration is going to need to be able to adapt rapidly and continuously to rebuild the United States' relationship with the international community and the world all over. It's not going to be easy, but there's not going to be a return to normalcy either. If anything, it's going to be a new order that Biden and the United States is going to have to learn to live with. In domestic news, we now turn to a new expose on the Trump administration's attempted coup over our political system. Leaked documents reveal that despite having lost the election in 2020, the Trump administration attempted to overturn the election in planned detail. The document in question is a memo obtained by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, who obtained it for their book, Peril. Using the Electoral Count Act, Trump allies John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani worked to try and persuade then Vice President Mike Pence to invalidate the electors in states that the campaign considered invalid. While it is pretty clear that Trump was planning to try and overturn the election, it is now surprising how far they were willing to go and in what detail. It's also worth noting that the Trump administration knew that this entire argument was nonsense and was based on a lie of voter fraud. Another leaked memo submitted in a defamation case brought against Trump allies by former Dominion employee Eric Coomer showed that not only did Trump and his allies have evidence to the contrary to their ridiculous claims, but they actively were passing around a memo saying as such. So at what point does this conspiracy theory nonsense die? The idea that the 2020 election was stolen is a fabrication, and the Trump administration knew it and went along with it anyway. They lied to the American public, wasted our time, and then convinced a bunch of gullible people to go to the Capitol to protest, only for it to end exactly as one would expect with this kind of rhetoric, with violence. If you think Trump cares about you, then let this be a wake-up call, because they knew they were full of crap from the very beginning of this whole thing. They lied to you, America. They lied, and people died. Speaking of corruption and deception, we now turn to Representative Lauren Boebert. The Denver Post reported that Boebert paid rent and utility bills with campaign donations, though she repaid them later. Despite the rapid repayment, FEC officials such as Shannon Ringgold noted that the payments being private of nature means that they could merit criminal action. This is not the first time that Boebert and her campaign have failed to transparently report or deal with the money of their constituents responsibly. In August, Boebert did not disclose that her husband was making $478,000 as a gas and oil consultant. Now, I bring this up not to just disparage Boebert as a conservative, but I want to make a point about how weak our campaign finance laws are, to the point where someone can clearly violate the letter of the law, and just because they paid the money back, they get to get around the law itself. Campaigns do not allow people to use their finances for personal use. Period. You should never have that power in the first place. People give you money when you run for a campaign to serve them as a public representative. It does not matter about your personal finances. It does not matter your personal convenience. And the fact that this is a common occurrence and a thing that just goes under the water speaks volumes about our society. If we are to form a more perfect union, we have to demand more of our leaders. And the fact that it is not incumbent on these leaders to actively put their money where their mouth is and show themselves to be transparent speaks volumes not just about what our government does, but what we demand of our government. So here's what I want you to take away from this. Rather than just pointing to Lauren Boebert and saying, haha, funny conservative hypocrite, she's engaging in all the crazy stuff that every other politician has ever done, I want you to think about why and how this becomes common in the first place. What about our system allows our government to do this in such a way that it becomes so transparently traditional that we don't even bat an eye about this? And the sooner you ask those questions, the more aware you'll become, not just as a citizen, but as a political operative. I really wish Americans paid more attention to campaign finance, not just because it's dirty as all hell, but because if we actively wanted to change this, we really could. We could put enough pressure on them to the point where it would not matter how much money they put into this. Nina Turner raised more money in her race and she still lost. And as much as I supported her, that doesn't change that the people voted against her. Money has its limits. And we can make that the reality through our entire democracy if we actively push back on our current system. So I'm doing this again to respond to Tucker Carlson, but I don't really think there is a response to be made there. People who are familiar with this show will know that Tucker Carlson comes up quite a bit, unfortunately, and it is partially because he's just insufferable, but it's also because his unwillingness to stop engaging in nonsensical rhetoric, whether it's scientific or historical, is just so well known that it merits a constant response. And this is especially true with vaccines. Recently, he has decided to argue that mandating vaccines, specifically the COVID-19 vaccination requirements in the military force, is an attempt to eliminate the political opposition in the U.S. Armed Forces.
If mandatory vaccination is to identify the sincere Christians in the ranks, the free thinkers, the men with high testosterone levels, and anyone else who does not love Joe Biden, and make them leave immediately. It's a takeover of the U.S. military.
Now, I'm not going to comment on the weird testosterone level comment. I'm not quite sure what form of toxic masculinity is involved there. But I want to address this argument that he's making. It's ridiculous on its face, since it's arguing pretty simply that if you get vaccinated, if you comply with these rules, you are not Christian, you're not a free thinker. Which is funny considering the majority of Americans are both Christian and vaccinated. So unless Carlson is suggesting that a majority of Americans are not good Christians, or is any way implying that vaccines are inherently anti-God, it seems like this argument is just made up hot air. Also, it kind of reveals a fundamental misunderstanding in the military. For one, mandatory vaccines and things like that have been around for a long time. The same goes for schools. The fact that Carlson, who makes millions off of his lies and deception, gets to go on air and say this nonsense repeatedly day in and day out is particularly funny when you consider the fact that he is almost certainly vaccinated because Fox News requires it to be in their business locations. It's kind of funny that this person who wants to claim that anybody who complies with vaccine mandates is somehow not a Christian or not a true American, an independent thinker even, when he himself has a vaccine running through him, keeping him safe, while his audience, many of whom will probably follow through with his nonsensical rhetoric, are going to pay the price. That's something I will never forgive him for, and neither should you. That's all for this week's episode. Thanks for joining me. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to share it to your friends. If you want to see more content outside of the podcast, consider checking out the newsletter on Substack, which you can find in the podcast notes below. Thanks again for watching, and have a wonderful day.